Hey everybody, this is vandweller recording for deucescrack.com, and this video is entitled ICM from Scratch, or How to Spend Several Hours Building the Ugliest Sit-and-Go Tool Available Anywhere Using Free Stuff You Probably Already Have Lying Around. And I sort of have a penchant for long titles, and for that I apologize. Now there are many software programs that you can buy that will do push-fold calculations for sit-and-goes using ICM, or the independent chip model, like sit-and-go power tools, or sit-and-go wizard, sit-and-go endgame trainer, and sit-and-go blah blah blah. You know, if you can think of two letters that come after the word sit-and-go, there's probably an ICM program with that name. And all of these actually combine three sort of basic calculators, and one of them is a showdown calculator, sort of like Poker Stove. Another one is a pot odds calculator, and the other is an ICM calculator. However, if you already have a spreadsheet program, like for example Microsoft Office, which you have to pay for, or OpenOffice, which you can get at openoffice.org, and that's free. Or you can actually, on Google, there's something on Google Documents, and you can actually create and use spreadsheets through Google, and that's totally free. So if you have a spreadsheet program, which now that there are free options, you have no excuse not to, Poker Stove, which is free, and some basic math and Excel skills, which hopefully we're going to give you in this video, then you can do all, the same things that those ICM calculators do, but do it yourself and do it all for free. And while you might not use such a thing as sort of your basic everyday ICM program, although I often do, because it's a little more flexible and I can sort of see exactly what I'm doing all this by hand, sort of ICM sort of from the very beginning, starting with nothing, doing that all by hand at least a few times will deepen your understanding of the underlying factors of the push-fold decision, and ultimately this will translate into sort of a heightened awareness of these factors in real-time decisions. And I would say this, ultimately, if you can't build sort of a crude working ICM push-fold calculator from scratch like we're going to do, then I would say really you don't understand ICM in any deep way. And when you play and think about sit-and-goes, all you're really doing is just sort of mimicking the moves that books and sit-and-go wizard or sit-and-go power tools or people on forums tell you are the right moves. So what we're going to do in this video is we are going to start from a completely blank spreadsheet page like that, and we are going to build a working ICM calculator in real time. But first, there are a few preliminaries to sort of get out of the way, so that for those of you who don't understand how ICM even works, like even on a superficial level, it would be good to sort of go over that. Now, at the beginning of, say, a 10-player sit-and-go, it's like $100 buy-in with 1,000 chip starting stacks. Each chip can be said to have a value of 10 cents, right? I mean, it's a $100 buy-in. We get 1,000 chips, so you do the division, and that's 10 cents per chip. Now, what happens at the end of this sit-and-go? And hopefully you end up in first place and you beat the other 9 players. Well, you win all 10,000 chips, right? But you only end up winning $500 and not 1,000. I mean, there's $1,000 in the prize pool. You won everything, and yet you only win 500 chips. So each chip now can be said to have a value of 5 cents a piece, right? $500 divided by 10,000 chips, if I've done the math right, should be a nickel per chip. So where did the other nickel go? Well, it got divvied up by the second and third place players, who even though they busted out before you, they got a prize. And that's sort of how sit-and-goes work, right? And so as you approach 10,000 chips, as you go from your original stack of 1,000 all the way up to 10,000, each additional chip you gain is worth less than the chip previous. So the chips you start out with are 10 cents a piece, and then as you make your way toward 10,000, they sort of go down in value until such time as you win them all, and then they're worth about, they're worth exactly a nickel a piece. Now, the fact that chips change value really is the primary difference between a sit and go and a cash game, and it's a big difference. But on a deeper level, decisions in both sit and goes and cash games are analyzable by the same math, really. Now, and I'll get more into that if that doesn't sound correct to you. Now, a sit and go is a game that looks like it's played with chips, right? I mean, we're raising, we re-raise, we shove all in, and we're doing it with chips, right? Guy has to call, you have to think, well, do I call the 1,200 chips or what? So it looks like we're playing with chips, but we really aren't. Sit and goes are really played with something that is called equity. So while it's chips that are changing hands and moving around and so forth, under the surface, it's actually that thing called equity that is actually moving around. And what is equity? Well, equity is your share of the tournament or the total prize pool as represented by your stack and its relationship to the other stack. So having so many chips is worth a certain amount of the total prize pool, and that's what your equity is. Now, as I said, equity is, what we're playing with fundamentally, even though it looks like we're playing with chips, right? So equity is the currency, you might say, of sit and goes and tournaments, for that matter. Other tournaments, whether one table or not. But so sites, when you're playing on poker sites, Full Tilt or Poker Stars, whatever, they don't display your equity on the screen, even though that's what we're actually playing with. So the trick of winning sit and goes is to learn how to correlate the movement of chips with the movement of equity. Our only clue as to what's happening equity-wise is how people's what people's chip stacks are. So if we can learn to sort of map how chips move around the table with how equity moves around the table, then we'll be a lot further ahead of the game, because then we actually know how we stand in the tournament. Now, we have sort of a method to do that, and that method that we have, at least today, and it's sort of the current method, it's called the independent chip model. And what it does is it measures the amount of equity your stack represents and how winning and losing chips affects your equity. Now, just so you don't think that ICM sort of just came out of just someone's head, just fully formed one day, it didn't. It really is the result of discussion and debate that's been taking place since, well, as long as people have been playing tournament poker for one thing, but really since the late 90s and early 2000s. And there were other sort of outdated and less accurate tournament equity models. One of them is the proportional chip model, and one's the Landrum-Burns model, and there's other there are other models out there, and we're not really gonna get into that. But really, what they did is they had their outgrowth basically to try to model your tournament equity. It was really to get a grasp on how to chop up tournaments, right? You'd end up with 6 players left in a certain payout, and players would very often want to chop up like a multi-table tournament. So what people were trying to discover was, well, how can we get an accurate representation of how often each player would win and how much they would win based on what the current chip stacks are. And so people came to try to figure this out mathematically, and again, there were older, sort of less accurate tournament equity models, and but the one we currently use, which seems to be the most accurate, is called the independent chip model. And for just to indicate, the proportional chip model was pretty stupid. As we know, in a sit and go, for example, your equity can never be more than 50%, since first place is 50% of the tournament, right? So so your equity at any given point in the tournament can never be higher than like the final prize. So, but the proportional chip model, though, you can actually set stacks up in such a way that it will say that you have more than 50%. So obviously that's wrong. And then the Landrum-Burns model had some problems in the sense that it overvalued short stacks and undervalued big stacks. So anyway, ICM is really, an outgrowth of a debate and a discussion that's been happening, longer than there have even been sit and goes. So another thing I want to clear up before we sort of get started, with the real meat of the presentation, is that while it is common, in popular speech to equate ICM with the pre-flop push-fold decision, this is really only a loose way of talking, right? You'll be in a forum, and it'll say, well, ICM says fold, or ICM says push. Well, ICM doesn't really say any such thing. The push-fold decision is determined by an EV calculation that has 4 factors as inputs, and those of you who saw my previous video are going to recognize this. And those 4 factors are basically fold equity, how often a person's going to fold to your shove, showdown percentage of your hand, tournament equity at risk, and tournament equity that you stand to gain by making the shove. And ICM is a tool that helps us model or estimate only 2 of those, which is our tournament equity, our current tournament equity at risk, and our potential tournament equity gains. So even though people say, well, ICM means push-fold, well, ICM doesn't do that. All it does is tell you how to value your stack and any potential gain in chips or loss in chips. You still need to consider the other factors, fold equity and showdown percentage, in order to arrive at a good push-fold decision. So as I say, strictly speaking, ICM doesn't equal push-fold. Now, if you want to, in a loose way, say, okay, ICM says push, that's okay, as long as you realize that, technically speaking, that isn't the case. And there are actually errors that, in playing and in thinking about sit and goes, that actually arise from that. So it's not a trivial observation to make. Now, once you have calculated your equity and the equity of any potential gains or losses, you plug these numbers into the standard, shove EV equation that you would use in cash games or tournaments or whatever. So from this perspective, push-fold in tournaments is really mathematically identical to push-fold in a cash game or a satellite. And the reason is because the only things that are different are the inputs for the risk and reward, right? So in a cash game, so here's the formula for a cash game, right? I'm not going to read it, but I will explain it, as I did in my previous video. If you watched that, you're familiar with this. The EV of a shove, well, when you shove, one of 2 things is going to happen, right? Either they're going to fold and you win the amount in the pre-flop pot, the blinds and antes, or they're going to call. And when they do call, you're going to be in a gambling situation where either you're going to win, and when you win, you're going to win, the amount of your stack or the effective stack plus any dead money. And when you lose, you're going to lose the amount of your stack, or again, the effective stack. And that's a cash game formula. But the only difference between that and a tournament or sit and go is that the inputs are a little bit different, in the sense that what we win is not the pre-flop pot, but the equity gain that is represented by winning that pot relative to our stack. I mean, that seems wordy and complex, but that's what it comes down to. And when we win after we're called, we don't win necessarily the amount of our stack plus the dead money. We represent the equity. We win the equity gain represented by winning the amount of chips that the amount of equity that winning our stack represents relative to our stack and the other stacks in the tournament, and similarly with what we lose when we lose our stack. So the basic idea that underlies ICM is the supposition that your chance of finishing first in the tournament is equal to your percentage of the total chips in play. You get that? Now, here's the example, right? Suppose you have 2,500 chips out of the 13,500 total chips that you would have in a regular 9-handed sit and go with 1,500 chip stacks to start. So you have 2,500 of the 13,500 total chips, and so that means that your chance of finishing first in the tournament is equal to, well, 2,500 divided by 13,500, or 18.51%. And that is really as difficult as the math gets. It might get more complex, and there might be many more steps involved, but if you can do that math, which is like 4th grade math, or less, I don't even remember, if you can do that, and you can sustain the focus to do that math many times over, then you can calculate your ICM just starting from a stack setup. And so what ICM does is it assesses, given your percentage of the total chips, how likely you are to finish first and second and third. And then what you do is you multiply your chances of finishing in each of those places by the value of each place. And what is the value of each place? Well, the value of each place is going to depend on the payout structure of the game, right? So in a standard 50, 30, 20 sit and go, where first place pays 50%, second place 30%, and third place 20%, you multiply your chance of finishing first by what? 50%, 0.5. You multiply your chance of finishing in second by 0.3, and your chance of finishing in third by 0.2. And then what you do is you then add these three figures. Well, what three figures? The three figures that you get from multiplying your various chances of finishing in the various places by the payouts, and you add those three figures to arrive at your total equity. So, for example, let's say that given how the stacks are set up, let's say that you have a 49% chance of finishing in first, you have a 32% chance of finishing in second, and you have a 15% chance of finishing in third. And we don't really need to know our chance of finishing in fourth because there's no payout for it, but it's there, so we may as well. Your equity in the tournament is going to be, well, this equation. It's going to be 49% times the value of first, which is 50%, and 32% times the value of second, which is 30%, and 15% times the value of third, which is 20%, and I just threw in fourth place just for the hell of it. So you add all that across, you multiply all those and you add it across, and you get 37.07%, and so that would be your total share of the prize pool given that stack setup. So one other thing to note is that equities are interdependent. Your chances of finishing in any given place depends on the other player's chances of finishing in whichever place. So therefore, to calculate one player's equity, ultimately we have to calculate all the remaining players' equity. So once we've done that, once we've actually calculated our equity, we can then calculate the value of any gain or loss of chips, right? And by comparing what our equity is now to what it would be if we gained, and what it would be if we lost the chips, and so forth. And we'll get into that in time. And of course, once we know that, we can gauge how strong a hand we need in order to push all in or to call off all our chips. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let's go ahead and get started actually building the spreadsheet. Now, I want to note that for that the method that we're using here, you can do it for however many players you want. But for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of brevity, the spreadsheet we're going to build is only going to cover 4 places, 4 players remaining in the sit and go. For one thing, that is a useful thing to be able to use, and the other thing is that doing any more than that gets to be really, really tedious and time consuming, which, I mean, you can do it, and I have done it. I've built a sit and go spreadsheet, I think it was like 2 years ago. I built one that went all the way up to 10 players, and it took me, if I remember correctly, I mean, pretty much a whole day, like from the morning when I woke up, like 8 in the morning, to when I went to bed, which is around midnight or 1 o'clock. I mean, it took me a long time, and it's probably because I was trying to work out some more of the math myself. I think if I did it now, it would take me a little bit less, but it can take a long time. So, and I'm not going to make a 20-hour video, even though sometimes I push it. But so you can, the method is the same, and once you learn the method, you can do it for however many players that you have the ambition to do so. But we're only going to be covering 4. So the first step, as we sort of indicated, is to determine each player's chance of finishing first. And as we said, a player's chance of finishing first in the tournament is the percentage of chips that he has in the tournament. So let's go ahead and take a look at the sheet and how to do that. Before I get started actually working with the sheet, though, I want to indicate to you that I'm not going to actually type out every single thing that we have to do on the sheet, during the video. More often than not, I'm going to be like telling you, giving you a couple of examples of a calculation, and then leaving it to you to fill it in, and then I'll come back, sort of. I'll be doing it out in real time too, but I'm going to pause the video during the more tedious parts, tell you what I'm doing, and then come back and show you what I did. That way you can see if your results match mine. So the first thing I'm going to do, and you'll see that there's sort of a value in doing this, is I'm going to cordon off a certain little area of this spreadsheet. And if you don't know much about Excel, believe me, I don't know that much myself. I know just enough to sort of get me by. I'm pretty obsessive about formatting. Like, I need stuff centered and bolded and so forth. So I apologize for that. So I'm sort of cordoning off these first few things because this is a section where we're going to actually calculate ICM, and then the rest of the area here is going to be needed for determining other things. So here I'm going to make a list of players, and let me type those players in. So as you can see, I'm deciding to use some guys from Deuces Cracked, AMT, vandweller, Bones, and Joe Tall. And here is where we're going to list what the actual stacks are. And what I like to do when I'm making a spreadsheet is anything that there are going to be parts, that I'm able to edit, and parts that I'm not going to want to edit for fear of ruining the spreadsheet. So what I like to do is make parts that are editable. I like to make that sort of a different color. And here we'll just make that this sort of pale green color or whatever. And we're going to want to have an area for totals. And we're going to need to, otherwise I'll go crazy. We're going to need to bold and center that. And this part we're not going to want to edit. So we're going to start out with just chip stacks like this: 4,000, 3,000 for vandweller. Poor Bones only gets 1,500. And somehow, improbably, Joe Tall has the biggest stack. And then what we're going to want to do is go ahead, since we have to know a player's percentage of the total chips, we're going to need to know, well, what are the total chips, right? So here in the totals column, we're just going to use the sum feature. If you don't know that, you can use plus signs, but we're going to do, whoops, I'm so bad with Excel. I mean, it's going to be really embarrassing. Let's see, the sum, we want to sum up cells B3 through B6, right? So we'll use B3 through, I think is a colon, B6, and that should give us the total chips. And of course, we're always going to want to make sure that the total chips that we have add up to 13,500 if it's a standard kind of 9-player 1,500 starting stack sit and go. So as we said, we're going to want to determine each player's chance of finishing in first place, right? And we said that is his percentage of the total chips. So for example, AMT, his chance of finishing in first is going to be his chips divided by the total chips. So that's basically, we'll put an equal sign here, and that is going to be this cell divided by, which is a slash, the total chips, right? And so we get that, and vandweller is going to be similar, equal sign this divided by this. Oops. See, I'm doing it wrong already. Make sure you hit the check mark. Bones, equal sign this divided by that, and Joe Tall will be this divided by that. So what we're going to do though is we want to sort of convert these into percentages, and we're going to have a whole bunch of other things here which are going to be percentages. So we may as well just go into format, cells, numbers, percents. There we go. And not to give away too much, but we are going to also have similar columns for second and third. Where's a 3? Third and fourth, which we may as well go and just make those columns now and bold them and so forth. So, and then one thing I sort of like to do is sort of total each of these columns, because they should all equal 100%. So we can do that same sum feature we did before, and I'm pretty sure you can drag across here. Like if you click in there and then start here and do that, there, that should be 100%. And as we can see in our example, AMT has a 30% chance of finishing first. So, you know, the spreadsheet is a little more, you know, accurate to, or more precise. But AMT has about a 30% chance. vandweller has a 22% chance. Bones has an 11% chance, and Joe Tull has a 37% chance. So now that we've calculated how often each player finishes in first, we need to calculate second. And so each player is going to finish in first, as we just calculated, a certain percentage of the time. Then, so given the chance that each player has of finishing in first, we calculate the chance of each other player's finishing first, you know, quote first, behind him. So the player who we assume finishes first, right, his chips are taken out of the equation. And then each remaining player's chance of finishing second is his percentage of the remaining chips, right? So, you know, not counting, and by remaining chips I mean all the chips, not counting the player who finished first. So then we multiply each result that we get by the percentage of times the first player finishes first, and then we get a value for second place. So, for example, right, AMT is going to finish first 37% of the time, right? And he has 4,000. Whoops. Sorry about that. I realized I actually had a little glitch in my in the goings here. I actually have to change that because I realized that all the examples in my spreadsheet, I sort of got the stack distribution wrong here. So sorry, Joe Tull. And there we go. So anyway, as you can see, all the equities, all the first place chances actually finished to how they're supposed to. So we got that part right. So let's see. Where are we now? Oh, shoot. All right, sorry, a little difficulty here. All right, there it is. So the player who we assume, in order to finish, going back to what we're supposed to be doing, the player who we assume finishes first, his chips are taken out of the equation, right? And each remaining player's chance of finishing in second is his percentage of the remaining chips after we take that first place player's chips out, right? Each remaining player's chance of finishing second is the percentage of his remaining of the total remaining chips. And then we multiply each result that we get for each player by the percentage of times that the first player actually finishes first. So, for example, AMT finishes first 37% of the time, right? So we're going to take his chips out of the equation, and he had 5,000 chips, right? So that means there are 8,500 total chips left between the three players who didn't finish in first, right? vandweller has 4,000 of them. So we multiply, we divide 4,000 by the remaining 8,500 chips, and then we multiply that number by the percentage of the time that AMT finishes in first, and we get a number that's around 17%. Bones, similarly, he has 1,500 of the total remaining 8,500 chips. We do the division, we multiply by 37%, and we get 7%. And then Joe Tull, he has 3,000 of the 8,500 remaining chips. We do the division, we multiply by 37%, and we get 13%. And if you notice, you know, since we know AMT finishes 37% of the time, the numbers that each player finishes second behind him, those total results we have are going to equal 37. So 17 plus 7 is 24, plus 13 is 37. So let's go and see how we would do this in the spreadsheet. And if you didn't follow any of that, once we do it in the spreadsheet, it'll become more clear. So what we're going to want to do is create another column here called chance of second. And this is sort of where the main calculations are going to happen. Chance of second. And we need to bold and make that a color. again, because I'm pretty obsessive. So what we're presuming is that assume AMT wins, right? AMT wins, and then Van is going to have a certain percentage, Bones, and Joe, right? So what was vandweller's chance of finishing in second? Well, we said that we assume that AMT wins, so we take his chips out of the equation, right? And then we divide vandweller's chips by the remaining chips. So what we're going to do, what are vandweller's chips? Vandweller's chips are here, right? And we want to divide that by the chips, the remaining chips in the tournaments, not counting AMTs, right? So that's going to be divided by, and divided by what? Well, divided by this. Whoops, I don't know why that's there. Sorry, I'm kind of an Excel noob. So this plus this plus that, right? Or if you wanted to, do it another way, you could just do it divided by the. In fact, we are going to do it this way: divided by the total chips, right, minus the winner's chips, right? So that's vandweller's chance, given that AMT finishes in first. That's how often Van is going to come in second behind. But what we want to do is take that whole thing and multiply it by the percentage chance that AMT wins. And what is that? Well, we know what that is because we already finished that, right? We did that. So we're going to multiply that whole thing by D3, right? And so there we get the 17%. And did that come out right? Thank God it did. And so we want to do the same thing for each player, and we'll do Bones here. I don't know why does it say Hone? It's supposed to say Joe Tall. I don't get that. So Bones is gonna, or we can just say Joe, because that's how we're gonna do it. I don't want to type Joe Tall every single time. So Bones, his chance of finishing in second is what? Well, it's his stack divided by, where's divided by? There it is. Divided by the remaining chips, but not counting AMT's chips, right? So the remaining chips minus the winner's chips. And then we want to take that whole thing, so we need to put parentheses around it, and we need to multiply that by the chance that AMT finishes first. And that is that. And we hit the check mark. And did it come out to the 7% I thought it would? It did. Now, of course, the 17% isn't the actual precise thing. There are more digits beyond this. But, we're just having it display up to 2 digits. But, it's more... They're in there. It's just they're not being displayed. So I hope you get that basic method to determine how each player finishes first, given how often AMT wins. Well, I guess we'll do Joe, too. And then we'll... go on to the other scenarios. So Joe is going to win what? His stack divided by the total chips, not counting AMT's chips, right? Minus AMT's chips, close parentheses, and then we need to put that whole thing in parentheses and multiply it by AMT's chances. So multiply and then AMT's chances, and there we get the 13%. Okay, so are we done? No, we're not done, because AMT is not the only guy who has a chance of finishing in first, right? Every single player has a chance of finishing in first. So, for example, Van could win, right? Van wins, right? And when vandweller wins, well, AMT is going to have a certain percentage of the time that he can win. Bones will win a certain percentage of the time that, that Van wins, and Joe Tall will. Okay, but Bones could also win, right? And when he does, AMT will finish in second a certain percentage of the time. Vandweller will finish in second a certain percentage of the time, and Joe Tall will finish in second a certain percentage of the time. And similarly for Joe Tall, when he wins, then AMT, Bones, and, well, I want to put Van first just to keep everything in order. Van and Bones. And so let's bold this to make sure that we know what we're doing. And this should say Bones wins, right? And this should say Joe wins. And it should be in bold. Did that do that? No, put it in bold. There you go. So then we need to do the same exact procedure we did when we assumed AMT wins for when each other player wins, and then find out, how often each player finishes second behind him. So I'm just going to do one more example of that, and then I'm going to leave you to fill in the rest, and then I'm going to show you what I came up with, and if yours matches mine, then you did it right. So we know vandweller is going to win. Well, we have to take his chips out of the equation, right? So if we want to find out how often AMT comes in second behind him, hit the equal sign. We want to have AMT stack, right, divided by the remaining chips. And the remaining chips are the total chips minus vandweller's chips, right? And then we want to multiply that whole thing by how often vandweller actually finishes in first, right? So we've got the parentheses around that. We're going to multiply that by how often vandweller finishes in first, and we know how often that is because we did it. It's D4, right? We put the check mark, and we get our value for that. So what I want you to do is go ahead and fill in. I'm going to pause the video, and I want you to go ahead and fill in the rest of these, and I'm going to do the same thing, and hopefully we'll come out with the same numbers, and you'll see if you did it right. So now we're back, and I have gone ahead and finished my spreadsheet, or filled in my spreadsheet for chance of second, and hopefully you've done the same thing. Boy, I want to make that. I'm so anal when it comes to these kind of things. I want to make that. There we go. That's better. And if your numbers match mine, then you probably did it right. So now what we need to do is figure out, are we done? Well, we're not done. What we need to do is figure out how often each player finishes in second total, right? So what we do is we find each player's name in this list and add all his values together. So if we want to find how often AMT finishes in second total, given all the scenarios, we find each example of AMT here and add them together, right? And I guess that's sort of what I say in my slideshow here. Each player will have then 3 ways he can finish second with corresponding percentages. We add these 3 percentages together to get his total chance of finishing in second. And so the example, if we're doing vandweller, we know that vandweller's chances, well, AMT first and van second is 17%, right? As it says here. Bones first, van second is 4%. Bones first, van second, 4%. And Joe first, van second is 8%. Does it say that? Joe first, van second, 8%. And so we add up all those together, and then we get Van's total chance of second place, which is 30% roughly. So that's what we're going to do for each player here to determine their chance of finishing second. So for AMT, for example, we want to find each of his. So we're going to hit the equal sign. We're going to find the first one here, right? That, which is L8, plus that, plus that. All right. And so we get 30.81% of the time. vandweller is going to finish second. The individual chances of him finishing in second. So it's going to equal that plus where is it? That plus that. Oops, we don't need another plus. Hit the check mark, and 29.6% of the time. And so similarly for Bones and Joe Tall, which I'll do right now off camera. So I've gone ahead and done Bones, which should be 14.39%, and Joe Tall 25.21%. As you can see, I've also totaled up this column just to make sure everything sort of checks out and adds up to 100%. So there it is. Now we know each player's chance of finishing in second place. So the next step is to determine our and everyone else's chance of coming in third. And really there's no difference in doing this than there was in doing it in second place, right? So when we did second place, there were basically 12 combinations, right, for 4 players to finish first and second, right? So here are the first and second scenarios, right? AMT Van, AMT Bones, AMT Joe, Van AMT, Van Bones, Van Joe, etc., and so forth, right? So there are 12 combinations for 4 players to finish first and second. And so for each of those combinations, we then just like we did before, eliminate the chips of those top 2 players from the equation, right? And then each remaining player's chance, each of the 2 remaining players' chance of finishing third is his percentage of the remaining chips when you take out the first and second player's chips, right? And then as before, we multiply each player's results by the percentage chance of that, the first, second scenario, the chance that that occurs, right? So for example, AMT finishes first and Van finishes second. When AMT wins and Van comes in second, well, of course, that was 17% of the time, which we know because it was right here. And when that happens, Bones has 1,500 of the remaining 4,500 chips. So 1,500 divided by 4,500, right, times 0.17, the time that this AMT Van scenario happens. And then we get a percentage, 5.6%. And so then we do this for each player in each first, second scenario. And then as before, we total the individual chances for each player to finish third to find his overall chance of finishing third. So let's go ahead and do that on the sheet. So I've gone ahead here and made a little column for a chance of third. And then for each one of these scenarios, from above, we go ahead and see what players are left. So for example, AMT first, Van second, right? That was the first one right here, right? And when that scenario occurs, Bones is going to still be in it, and Joe is still going to be in it, right? So then we're going to have AMT first, Bones second, right? And then who's going to be left? Well, Van and Joe, etc. and so forth. I'll do, obviously AMT first and Joe second, right? So those are the 3 scenarios for when, well, there should be, right, Van, Bones, and Joe. Joe second, and then who will be left? Well, Bones, Van and Bones. So those are the 3 scenarios that can occur, or at least actually the 6 scenarios that can occur for all the times AMT finishes in first, and then the various 3 players finish second behind him, and then there are 6 scenarios for how the remaining players will finish. So what we want to do is go ahead and sort of do that whole thing out. So the next one we do is going to be, Van wins AMT second, Van wins Bones second, Van wins Joe second. So I'm going to fill in this whole column here with that, and hopefully yours will match mine. So here it is, and I've actually gone ahead and capitalized all my AMTs because it was kind of just bothering me. I'm really anal when it comes to stuff like that. So as you can see, the 3 we did here, then Van AMT, Van Bones, Van Joe, Joe AMT, Joe Van, Joe Bones, Bones AMT, Bones Van, Bones Joe, etc. And then just listing the 2 remaining players that are left who don't finish in first and second. So then what we're going to want to do is figure out how often each of the remaining players finishes in third in each of these scenarios. So, for example, we know that Bones' chance of finishing third is what? Well, it's his percent, it's his chips, right, divided by the remaining chips, right? And the remaining chips are the chips that exclude the players who finish in first and second. So Bones' chips divided by the total chips. Well, I guess we don't need a parentheses. The total chips minus, right? What's this? AMT minus AMT and minus Van, right? So we know so that is, let's see, right. So then we hit that, and well, I don't know what the hell I did there. Hold on. Yeah, it was a parentheses issue. I'm always making mistakes with parentheses. So given that AMT wins and Van comes in second, Bones is going to finish in third 33% of the time. But then what we have to do is multiply that 33% of the time by the overall chance that AMT wins and Van comes seconds, right? So we're going to multiply this whole thing by, well, the chance that AMT wins and Van comes second. And we already know that. We don't need to calculate it because we already did it because it's right here. AMT wins, Van second, right? So we just click on that, and that's how often this overall AMT Van Bones scenario occurs. So we do the same thing for Joe Tall. We hit equals, and then we know it's Joe Tall's chips, right? Divided by the remaining chips, and the remaining chips are the total chips, right? And we want to do a parentheses. That's what I did wrong before. The total chips minus AMT's chips minus vandweller's chips, right? So we get 67% of the time, but then we need to multiply that by the overall chance that AMT wins and Van comes second, which we have to put this in parentheses. And we know what that number is because we already calculated it here. And the chance that AMT comes in first and Van second again is 17%. So we hit the multiply, we hit that, and we get that, right? So there it is, right? That's the chance that AMT wins, Van comes in second, and Joe Tall comes in third. That's sort of the conjunction of those three things, right? So if we want to do now, say, AMT, what happens, well, when AMT wins and Bones comes in second? We'll do one more, and then hopefully you'll get sort of the general idea, and then you'll be able to fill in all these, which is going to take a little while, but, you know, it's doable, and, you know, it'll take you a few minutes, but, you know, suck it up and do it. So let's see, we want to know Van's chance, and we know that Van's chance is what? Van's chips divided by what? The remaining chips, and the remaining chips are the total chips minus AMT's chips and minus Bones chips. Little parentheses there, and so we get 57%, but we know that we have to multiply that by the AMT Bones scenario. So we put this in parentheses, and then we find, let's see, multiply, and then the AMT Bones scenario is right here, and so we do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same exact method that I just used to fill in all of these, right? I'm going to do that obviously off camera, otherwise this video is going to take 3 hours. Well, not 3 hours, but a while. And then once you've done that, you can come back and see if your numbers match mine, and then you know you have done it right. So I've gone ahead and done that, and if you just look at the numbers, you'll see if yours match mine and whether or not you did it right. So now what we need to do, we've figured out how often each player is going to finish, you know, third in each of these individual scenarios. So now we need to find his overall chance of finishing third in each of those scenarios. So for example, AMT, we do it exactly the same way as we did second place. Remember, we found each of the individual chances and totaled them. We're going to do the same exact thing. So as it turns out, each player is going to have 6, I believe, different ways of finishing in third. So we need to find those 6 and then add them all together. So for AMT, we've got the equal sign here, and then we find all the AMTs, right? AMT, so that plus that plus that plus that plus that plus that, right? So we add up those individual things, and we get AMT finishes in third 22.26% of the time. So we do the same thing for each of the remaining 3 players, and I'll do vandweller, and then you can do off camera sort of the other 2. So the vandweller is going to equal what? That plus that plus where's another vandweller? Here we go. Whoops, I think I screwed up there. There we go. Van plus, make sure you hit the plus. Van plus Van plus Van plus Van. Was that 6? That is 6. So then we get 26.23% of the time. So as I said, I'm going to pause the video, do the remaining 2, you do the remaining 2, and make sure that your answers are the same as mine. So there they are. Bones finishes in third overall 21.57% of the time. Joe Tall 29.94% of the time. And then what I've gone ahead and done, just like the other ones, is just total them up just to check and make sure that everything adds up correctly. So now, so we've got third, right? That's third right there. We know exactly how often each player finishes in third. Now, while we don't actually have to calculate our chances of finishing in fourth, I mean, we may as well do it just for the purposes of satisfying my obsessive compulsive disorder. For each player, you simply add its chances of first, second, and third, and then subtract, obviously, the total from 1, so because 1 is 100%, and so forth. So here, we're just going to go 1 minus, right? And I guess we can either sum it or use the plus sign. We can use sum, well, actually 1 minus, there we go. 1 minus the sum of, if I could type. See, the problem is I'm in, my office is dark right now. Sum, and then we just kind of add across like that, and we get that, right? And so I think what you can do, if I'm not mistaken, you actually grab this and drag all the way down, and that should actually work in making changing the formula for each row and making it the same. So this one should be D3 through F3, and this one should D4 through F4. So you can actually grab that and drag it down. And then, of course, we want to total these just to make sure everything came out right. I mean, you don't have to, but I do it just to, you know, make sure that I didn't screw up. And so those 4 together should total 100%, and we did it right. So now that we know each player's chance of finishing in each place, I mean, right, that's all we've got so far is how often each player finishes in each place, right? We can then multiply these numbers by the value of finishing in each place, right? And so the value of each place is the percentage of the prize pool that each place wins. So, for example, we know that, you know, in a 50-30-20 standard, you know, single table sit and go, first place pays 50, second place pays 30, and third pays 20, right? So that we then multiply for example, AMT. We multiply his chance of finishing in first, which is 37% of the time, by 50%, and we get 18.5. Second place, he finishes in 31-ish, you know, obviously we're rounding, right? 31% of the time times the 30% that second pays, we get 9.3%, and he finishes in third 22-ish% of the time, which we multiply by 20%, which is the payout for third, and we get 4.4. So then for each player, we add the results of each place, and this is a player's total equity in the tournament. So for example, AMT, his equity is the 18.5% for first, 9.3% for second, 4.4% for third, and adding it across, we get 32.2% total tournament equity. So we're going to do that on the chart, right? We're going to take, let's see, tournament equity, which I always abbreviate TEQ, and we're going to bold that. All right, and so all we're doing is adding these, no, okay. What we have to do is determine the payouts and put a spot for the payouts, right? So what I've gone ahead and done is just wrote prize dist for prize distribution, first, second, and third. And then I want to make these editable, because just in case we want to deal with another format like 6 max or some other strange payout, then we'll be able to adjust the payouts and see how that affects the risk reward. So background, make that pale green. Where is that? I use that all the time. All right. So here we know that first place is going to be 0.5, which is 50%, 0.3 for second, 0.2, right? Let me make sure everything is centered, or I'm just going to go insane. All right, so everything's centered. So now what we can do is actually figure out the tournament equity by, and this is, you know, it's going to be sort of long, but I think you can handle it. It's going to be, remember, the chance of first times the value of first, plus the chance of second times the value of second, right? So the chance of first is right here, right, for AMT, for example. So the chance of first times the value of first, which is that, right? And then we're going to want to put that in parentheses. All right, and then here, let's just do this kind of in advance. Put a plus sign, parentheses, plus sign, parentheses, okay? So the chance of first times the value of first. And so now we want to do the chance of second, right, by the value of second, which is here, right? And why didn't that show up in the parentheses? I must have overwritten them. And then we want to do the chance of third, which is this, times the value of third, which is here. All right, and so then we want to make this whole column a percent. So let's go cells, number, and percent. All right, so now we see that, and did that match our slide? Yeah, just about. AMT's total equity in the tournament as a percentage is 32.21%. Now I'm going to do the same thing for vandweller just so you can see the method again, and then I'm going to let you fill in Bones and Joe Tall. So for vandweller, let's make our let's set it all up in advance, right? Parentheses plus parentheses plus parentheses, right? So the first parenthesis set of parentheses is his vandweller's chance of first times the value of first plus his chance of second times the value of second, and then in the other parentheses plus his chance of third times the value of third, right? And we get an error. Oh, because we didn't put the value of third here. So the value of third. There it is. All right, so that is vandweller's overall chance of those spots. Overall, chance of each of those spots times the value of each of those spots added together for his total equity in the tournament. So I'm going to let you go ahead and do Bones and Joe Tall on your own, and then I'll pause the video and come right back. So anyway, for Bones and Joe Tall, we get 14.19% and 24.66 respectively, and then we can go ahead and just sum those up and just make sure that it totals 100%. So let's do that, and it does. So that's cool, right? Now we know each player's equity in the tournament. So what we can do now, though, is actually we can, if we want, we can translate those into dollars, right, by knowing what the buy-in and so forth is. But I have to say that I usually prefer, and although I know many authors will present your equity in terms of dollars, like if you look in Jackal's book, Phil Shaw's book, he will present your equity in terms of dollars. Or many of the other presentations of this topic will present your equity in terms of dollars. I like to think in terms of percentages, because that way your thinking isn't tied to a particular buy-in, right? So, with these stack setups, no matter what the buy-in is, you always have 32.21% of the equity, whether it's a $2 tournament or a $2,000 tournament. So I like to think in those terms, and for other reasons too, which will become evident in future videos that I have planned, why I think it's more productive to think in terms of percentage in the prize pool than straight dollar amounts. So, but we can, since it's interesting, we can figure out dollar amounts, right? So what we do, for example, is say we have a $33 sit and go, right? 33 plus 3, like on full tilt. The prize pool is going to be $33 times 9 for each of the 9 players, or $297. So we just multiply each player's equity by the total prize pool. So, if AMT has 32.21% of the total prize pool as equity, then, obviously you multiply that by 297 and you get 95.67. So that's what we're going to do. We call $EQ, and let's make sure that that is bolded so I don't throw a conniption. So then what we're going to want to do is have fields here for the number of players, the buy-in, and the total prize pool, right? And that way we can, edit it for whatever number of, well, let's just call it prize pool. All right, and then we're going to want to be able to edit it for, whatever buy-in we're playing. So we're going to go ahead and make those two editable. Cells, background, and I think it's a good trick. So, for example, in this one, we're going to have 9, and the buy-in, obviously it doesn't include the rake, since the rake doesn't go toward the prize pool, so it's going to be 33. And the prize pool is going to be this times this, right? So, equals that times that. And so we get 297. And I don't know why I want to do this, but we'll just format it to make it dollars, just because we can. Currency. There it is. All right. So then to find each player's dollar equity in the tournament, we just multiply his tournament equity percentage by the total prize pool. So for AMT, that's going to be, let's see, equals this times this. So he's got 95.67, right? And then for vandweller, that's going to be this times this, and I don't know why it's not centered. And then, of course, I'll just pause it, and you can fill in Bones and Joe Tall. And now I'm back. And while you were gone, obviously I did Bones and Joe Tall. And what I also did is sort of what I did with these other columns, just to sort of as checks and balances. I added up, made a sum of these four numbers just to make sure they added up to 297, which is the total prize pool, and it does. So that all works out. And then what I also did is I made it calculate how much in dollar terms each place is actually worth. So obviously 50% times the prize pool equals that, and so forth for the other places. So now, I mean, we actually have an ICM calculator, right? This actually will calculate our equity. And so if we have these stacks, but if whatever stacks you put in, 3,000 here, 1 chip for vandweller, 5,000 chips for Bones, and I don't know, whatever would be left, 3,049. I mean, 3,000, well, whatever it would be. What was it? 8,000, so 3,500, whatever it is. It actually doesn't even matter. But the point is, we now can actually figure out a percentage for each, players given whatever stack distribution we want to give. If we give, one good way to check our math is to give everybody the same number of chips, right? So the same number of chips would be 3375, and therefore all their equities should be the same, right? And as you can see, all the equities end up being the same. So that's a good way to check that our math was correct, right? So we did it. We actually have a working ICM calculator, and it's fun to just kind of mess around and see what happens with equities. So, but now that we have it, what can we do with it besides play around with it? Well, for one thing, we can actually use it to evaluate how strong a hand we would need if someone shoved all in on us, and we were trying to decide whether to call or not. So the basic formula for the break-even call point is, well, it's our risk, what we're risking, divided by the risk plus the reward, right? So basically what we do is we take the amount of equity that we would lose if we lose the all-in, right, or the shove, and we take that amount of equity for the risk. And then how much equity we would gain if we won is the reward, right? And after plugging those numbers into the above formula, we arrive at a number. And that number is basically how often our hand needs to win against our opponent's range in order to call. And then what we can go ahead and do, once we have that number, we can then assign a range of hands to our opponent, and using Poker Stove, see if our actual hand shows down well enough, right? So how do we actually go ahead and do that on the spreadsheet is what we're going to do now. So there are basically three things that we're going to need to know, and I've set up a little section down here called calling, right? We're calling it all in. So hero equity, right? And there's three things we want to know. We want to know what it is now, because that's what we're, risking. We want to know what it will be if we win, what our equity will be if we win, and what it will be if we lose, right? And I'm going to bold all that. And then our output is going to be, let's see, a win percentage that we need, right? Win. I don't know what do you want to call it? Needed win, or we'll just call it needed percentage, right? How often you need to win the all-in in order to justify calling, given what you're risking and rewarding. And these three things are going to be editable. So we're going to make those cells blue, or pale green as they call it. I see it as blue. All right. So then what we need to do is sort of run three scenarios. And let me go back to the original stack setup that we had, because all my examples are they're set up that way. So what we need to know is, what is our equity now? And here we need to sort of use a little imagination, right? So let's say that we are in the big blind, right? And we're vandweller, and AMT is shoving on us, right? Well, what we need to do is see what is our equity now, right? Our equity now is, well, our equity, right? And I like to do it in terms of tournament equity, but I mean, well, I think that's more useful than you doing it in dollars. Again, I like to think in terms of tournament equity. So our equity now is 28.94, right? Now, what we have to do is sort of set up the stacks, what they would look like if we won, right? So if AMT shoved on us and we won, well, our chip stack would double, right? So we'd increase by 4,000, and AMT would be down to 1,000, right? So if we won, our equity would be 40.33, right? And if we lost, well, let's put it back to how it was. I mean, we're covered by AMT, right? So we don't need to calculate, you know, what our equity would be if we lost, because we'd be out. So we know that's going to be 0, right? So remember, the formula is risk divided by risk plus reward. Well, what are we risking, right? We are risking the difference between what our equity is now and what it would be if we lost, right? So the risk is going to be risk, let's see, now, right, minus this column, this cell, right? That's the risk. So let's see, where is it? Whoops. There we go. Sorry, somehow I deleted it. So it's basically this, what our equity is now, minus what it would be if we were to call and lose, which in this case is 0, but it won't always be 0 because we won't always be covered, right? So that's the risk, right? And so remember the formula. What was the formula? It was risk divided by risk plus reward, right? So we have that divided by, right, the risk again, B25 minus, whoops, I'm kind of typing in the dark, which is probably not a good idea, D25, right, risk plus reward. So that's the risk plus the reward. What is the reward? Well, the reward is the difference between what our equity is now and what it would be if we won, right? So the reward is, let's use little parentheses there just to make it clear. It is C25, right? That's what it would be if we won, minus what it is now, minus B25, right? So let's just make sure, because the order of operations and all that stuff from like 4th grade, let's make sure that's in parentheses. So as it turns out, and here, let's make that a percentage, right? Numbers, percent. So as it turns out, we would actually need to be a 71.76% favorite against the range. Remember, this is assuming we're vandweller in the big blind and AMT shoves on us, right? Even if he had any, so if he had any 2 cards, imagine he was shoving on us with any 2. We can actually go ahead and use like Poker Stove to determine, you know, how strong a hand we would need, or if, you know, whatever range we gave him. So I mean, we can go ahead and open Poker Stove right now. So there's Poker Stove, and we're going to give AMT a random hand, and we're going to give us, well, now it's where we can start to figure out what would we need. Like, for example, could we call with pocket 10s, right? I mean, just say we knew we were shoving with any 2 cards. Well, it's doing the enumerate all, which kind of takes a little while, but as we can see, looks like 10s are going to fall within the range. They're going to be somewhere in the mid-70s. Let's do Monte Carlo because it kind of approaches it faster. What about pocket 9s? Pocket 9s, right? We can start to see, well, we need about 71.76, and this looks like it's coming in around 72%. So certainly pocket 9s, right? Well, what about ace-king? Or we'll just give it the best case scenario and make it ace-king suited, right? Is ace-king suited good enough? No, we'd have to fold ace-king suited, right? So you can start to see, you know, what certain scenarios look like. And you can sort of play around with what you need. Now, I think this is far more instructive than, in my opinion, using Sit and Go Wizard. Now, we can look at another example. Let's say that we are AMT, right? And we're getting shoved on by vandweller, right? Well, if we what's AMT's equity now? Well, we know it's 32.21% because it says so right there, right? And what would our equity be if we won? Well, vandweller would be eliminated, right? And we would have 9,000 chips, right? So our tournament equity would actually be 42.74. And if we lost, well, vandweller would have his 8,000 chips, and we would have 1,000. All right. So then our equity, if we lost, would be 13.10%. And so if vandweller shoved on us, given this stack setup, we would need to be 64.47%. Now, of course, it's going to be less because, you know, even if we would call and we lose, we're still going to have some equity left in the tournament. So, you know, we're risking less than vandweller. So, in the previous scenario, so we can actually, you know, see how strong a hand we would need. So 64.47, we bring over our poker stove. Let's assume. I mean, we don't have to even assume it's a random hand. We can just say we know vandweller is really nitty. And he would only do this with, well, let's clear all this. He would only do it with like any Broadway or any pair, right? And any ace or whatever, you know. Obviously I don't have to come up with a totally reasonable scenario here because it's just an example. But let's just say vandweller is shoving something like that, right? Then we can sort of see, well, how does ace-king suited fare, right? Well, it's pretty darn close, right? So even if, you know, if he's shoving an nitty range, even ace-king suited is kind of close. You know, what about pocket tens again? How do pocket tens fare against that range, right? So we can see, do we have 64.7%? Well, no, we don't, not against that nitty range. Or you can, you know, widen the range, or, you know, any two, or whatever you want to do. So I think that's, you know, as I said, I think that's a little bit more instructive than just plugging the numbers into Sit and Go Wizard and then just staring at what it says to do. I mean, here it's an active process, right? You're actually involved in the learning. Whereas with Sit and Go Wizard, you just kind of plug it in and sort of accept whatever it says, and then you move on. But actually running it through your own mind, I think, you know, helps solidify it and makes you, I think, probably just a better thinker about Sit and Goes. So we've done that. We've used it to do all-in calls. Now, what about all-in shoves, right? Well, we can do that too. It's going to be a little bit more complex. The things that we're going to need to know are, well, what is our equity, just like in the previous example, what is our equity now? What would our equity be if we got called and lost? And what would it be if we got called and won, right? Just sort of like, you know, the previous, the calling example. But we also need to know, since we're shoving and he has the ability to fold or call, what would our equity be if he folded, right? How often would he call? What would our showdown percentage be against the range of hands that he would call with, right? So we can figure all that out. Now, the shove EV formula from before, and if you remember my previous video, we talked about it, is, you know, either he's going to fold or call. And when he folds, we're going to win the equity boost we get from winning the pre-flop pot. And when he calls, we're going to be gambling. And when we win the gamble, we're going to win the equity boost from, you know, doubling up or winning his stack. And when we lose, we're going to lose sort of the equity negative that we get if we lose our stack or the amount of the effective stack, right? And obviously, if the result of this whole thing, once we do it, is positive, it's going to be a shove, and otherwise, it's going to be a fold. So this is going to be probably the most complicated math that we do in the whole thing, so you just have to bear with me, but I think there's a real value in being able to do it. So let's see what that looks like in the spreadsheet. So I've gone ahead and cordoned off another little area with that colored bar, and it's, you know, very similar to before, hero's equity, right? So we're going to need it in a few different scenarios. We need to know what it is now, right? Whoops. We're going to need to know what it is if we get called and win, if we get called and lose, and we also need to know what it's going to be if we don't get called, right? Because we have the chance of just picking up, let me widen that a little bit, picking up the blinds without a fight. All right, so let's make all those bold. I'll make you bold. But that's not all we need to know, because we also need to know how often we're going to get called, right? Call percentage. How often is, when we shove, how often is this guy going to call, which is going to tell us how often we win the pot uncontested. And then we also need to know, if we are called, how often are we going to win you know, the pot? Like, what is our showdown equity? So we could call this showdown or whatever. We'll just call it showdown percent, right? And then we are going to need a section that is our percentage, that calculates or totals the EV of the entire move, right? So these are going to be editable. So we're going to make these, oops, if I could do this, there we go. Those are going to be editable, so we want to make those our color that indicates we can edit it. Same thing with these, right? Where is it? There it is. There's our pale green. All right, so it's the same kind of thing. We need to know what it would be now, what it would be if we won, if we lost, if we didn't get called, and then how often they're going to call and what the showdown percentage is, right? So this is, going to be sort of, again, as I said, the most complicated part. So you just have to sort of bear with me, and we'll get through it together. So we know, well, let's try to set up our parentheses sort of in advance. We know that a certain percentage of the time he's going to fold, right? And we can actually, well, a certain percentage of the time he's going to fold, and that's going to be the number that we put here in how often he calls, right? And we know that calling is just 1 minus folding, right? If he's calling 20%, then he's folding 1 minus 20%, which is 80%. So he's calling 1 minus the number we put into call percentage, right? That's going to be the fold, okay? And when he folds, what do we win? Well, we win, what would our equity be? Whoops, probably don't want to click on stuff when I'm in the middle. What would our equity be if we didn't get called minus what it is now, right? So we want to do times what our equity would be if we were uncalled, and that's this, right? Minus what it is now, right? The difference between what it is after we shove and he folds, there's a certain equity gain from winning the blinds, minus what it actually is now, and that tells us the percentage of increase. So we'll put that all in parentheses. So that's the fold part, right? The fold part was easy, right? And then we need to know when he calls, and what we do is we add, right? And so we're going to get into this gamble where he calls, and one of two things is going to happen, right? Either we're going to win or we're going to lose, right? So, and that governs, the parentheses are going to get a little insane here, so hopefully you can sort of follow. Basically, it should look like that, which kind of looks like a face or something. Which is not great advice, make your equation look like a face. So when he calls, we're either going to win a certain percentage of the time, and that is this number, right? Well, call percentage we're going to win is the showdown percentage number, right? When we win, so that's going to be this block, right? And when we win, what are we going to win? We're going to win the difference between what it would be if we won and what it is now, right? So we're going to win. This is what our equity would be if we won, minus what our equity starts out as, right? So there that is. And so then, let's see, so there's that. Do we have enough parentheses? We have enough parentheses. So then we need to find out how often we lose. And that's basically just going to be 1 minus how often we show down, right? So 1 minus that times what we would lose if we were to lose. And what do we lose? Well, we lose the difference between what it is now and what it would be if we lost, right? So it's going to be this minus this. And I would be shocked if this came out correct the first time. But we're going to go with it because I think I did it right. I found an error. Yeah, I forgot to put 1 parenthesis. And it's going to add it. Why did I put call in there? I didn't need to put call in there. See, I'm an idiot. That's okay. Did that come out? And now we have to take away that extra parenthesis. There we go. So, let's see if this works. Oh, for some reason I left, there's a little artifact from where it said call, right? Which I don't know, whoops, why that's there. So let's put our plus back in there. EV is 1. All right, so at least we're getting a number here. So let's go ahead and try to actually figure out a scenario. And I actually see, here we go, one error, which was this is supposed to be how often we get called, right? So B33 times, all right, we're getting this right. And then there should be another parenthesis. So I think that should end up equaling the right. All right, sorry about that. I just had one little tiny error. So that's the equation, right? So just make sure that yours looks like mine. Pause the video and put it in like that. And I think I just made a little error with parentheses and so forth. So it should, when there's nothing in it, it should be 0, which makes a lot of sense, right? So anyway, let's try to figure out a scenario, right? So let's say we are AMT and we are shoving. Well, no, let's be vandweller, okay? And we'll shove on AMT, right? And we'll just say arbitrarily the blinds are like 100, 200, or whatever. So hero's equity now is 28.94%. All right, and if we won, if we got called, right, and won, well, we would double our stack and he would have 1,000, right? We know this already. So we would be 40.33. Oops, 40.33. If we got called and lost, we would be at 0, right? So then the uncalled, right? Well, our original setup was this. So, we would win basically the big blind and so forth. 4,200 and he would have 4,800, something like that. So if we were uncalled, our equity would be 29.63, small increase, right, as expected. So let's say that we think he's only going to call 10% of the time, right? 10%. But when he calls, do we have to make that a percent? When he calls, we're going to be, say, only winning 40% of the time. So, all right, I had to take a little break and just make sure that when you're doing this, that all these blocks are in terms of percentages. Otherwise, you're going to get some wacky number, right? So just make sure that you go highlight these blocks. In fact, you want to do all of these. That's fine, like that. And you go into cells and make sure it's a percent, right? And in fact, make sure this one is a percent too, by the same way. So we have our, because I was doing it, I was getting a weird number. I'm like, this isn't right. So just make sure that each of these is a percent. So we've got those 4 values there. Let's assume we're getting called 10% of the time. But when we're called, we're a 40% favorite. Now, I don't know if there's a particular scenario that corresponds to. There probably is. The guy's calling pretty tight, but we have some sort of robust, like, pseudo connector or something like that. I mean, you can obviously be presented with certain scenarios and you'll know. But, we can actually do this. I mean, let's say that we wanted to shove. Well, let's see. What's the value of shoving any 2 cards, right? Well, let's say we're going to shove 100%, and let's say that he's only going to call us with Broadway cards and any pair and, aces and so forth. Now, that means he's calling us about 27% of the time, right? 27.6, right? And our showdown value when we get called is going to be what? Well, we're shoving any 2 cards, right? So, oh, shoot. Well, let's just type in 27.6. 27.6. All right, apply. There we go. And we know we're shoving any 2 cards. So we can see what the value of that is going to be. How often we're going to show down, right? And it looks like we're going to show down about 38.13%, we'll say. Right, 38.13% when we're called, right? So as we can see, by shoving here any 2 cards, probably not a good idea if we think he's calling with that range, right? Well, we can adjust it. We'll say, all right, well, maybe he's not calling that often, right? Or maybe we need to tighten up. So you can mess with those scenarios, right? Let's just say he's calling, just for the sake of, doing something, we'll just give him like 10%, right? Apply. Or 9.8%. So we'll say he's calling 9.8%, right? And when we show down, we've got any 2 cards. We're going to run that again. And here we're only winning, 32%. Oops, 32%. So that's, 32. There we go. And even that's negative EV. So, I mean, in the situation where, we are vandweller and we're making this shove in order to pick up the 200 in blinds, it's really not worth the risk of busting out, right? Now, if we want to take it from like, say that, let's put our stacks back how they were. Let's say that we're vandweller and we're going to shove on bones, right? So again, we take what is our equity now, and our equity now is 28.94. If we were to win, then we take Bones' chips away from him and he gets 0, and our equity would be 35.78, right? And if we were to lose, we're not out of the tournament. So what would the stacks look like if we lost? Well, let's see, our original is that. And we would give him 1,500 chips, and that means, so we would have 2,500, and he would have 3,000. Okay? So our equity, if we got called and lost, would be 20.85. And if we were uncalled, we'll just say that, we decrease his stack. Say the blinds are, again, 100, 200. We decrease his stack by 2,800 and increase ours, by 200 and increase ours by 200. And so if we're uncalled, our equity, uncalled, 4,200, and yeah, sorry about that, 1,300. There we go. So it would be 29.91. And now we can see, if even the same ranges, where if he's only calling 10% of the time and our showdown value with any two cards is 32%, now we can shove. It's positive because, we're risking less, right? There's a certain reward and there's a certain risk. So this, so we can calculate then, all right, let's say we know, let's say he's calling 20% of the time, Bones is. And when we show down, let's see, we'll give him top 20%, right? 20%. And what is our showdown value with 2 random cards against top 20%? Well, it's going to be about 36.4, it looks like. So showdown is going to be 36.4, and what did it say before? 19 point, whatever that was. Well, 20.4. Not that it's going to make a big difference to the math. So, and we can see that that's positive EV, even if he's calling that wide. So you can mess around with different scenarios. So I'm sorry if the going was a little bumpy. Sometimes Excel can get, a little testy if you don't know what you're doing, which I pretty much don't. I just know enough to make it work. So anyway, we now have a software tool that we made ourselves. We can actually calculate our equity and the equity of the other players. We can translate into a $%. We can calculate the EV of calling and all-in shove, given what we perceive our equity is going to be against his range, our showdown equity. And we can also calculate the equity if we want to shove on somebody by comparing, different risk-reward scenarios, how often we get called, and what our showdown percentage is going to be. Now you're going to see, if you run the same thing through Sit and Go Wizard, you're going to see slightly different numbers because it uses a slightly different method, which is more, it's pretty much the same thing, but it's got a couple of tweaks to it. But you will see that your results are not going to be that far off from it. So anyway, we've done that, and now this sort of sets us up for some observations. I mean, now that we know how ICM works and how to use it to answer sit and go problems, there are a few things to notice. For one thing, and I think this is most surprising to many players, is that notice that we have never once mentioned how many big blinds are in our stack, right? I mean, it's easy to think like, well, all right, I've got 15 big blinds, so I've got a lot of equity in the tournament. I've got 15 blinds. Or I only have 5 blinds, I don't have a lot of equity in the tournament. Well, in the course of calculating our equity by means of ICM, we've seen that it's really only the relative standings of the stacks that matter, right? I mean, if you look here, it doesn't say anything about big blinds, and it's only like how many chips you have in your stack, right? So therefore, and this sounds shocking, your equity doesn't care how many blinds you have. You can divide your stack into as many blinds as you want, and it will have no effect on your equity. I mean, what difference does it make if this 5,000 is in 5 chunks or 12 chunks or whatever? It doesn't make a difference, right? It's a mask in a lot of ways. So, for example, and thanks to my MS Paint skills, we have, each of the 4 players here in our scenario, and we've made it like the big blind is 500, right? So vandweller is going to have 6 blinds, and AMT is going to have 8. Joe Tall is going to have 10, and Bones is going to have 3. Well, how would our equity change if the big blind was 800? Well, it wouldn't. It's the same thing. The bars, if you see them, don't change. All that changes is the lines, and even these lines aren't accurate because, as we know, each chip you gain is less valuable than the ones previous. So actually, these ones at the bottom would be, bigger blocks than the ones up top. But I mean, you get the point, right? It doesn't matter how you divide it up, how you top up the stacks. It does not affect your equity. So if equity is, all that matters, and the number of big blinds you have has no connection to it, well, why do we even consider our stack in terms of big blinds when we're making decisions as sit and goes? Well, there are 2 main reasons, and there are probably more, but at least 2 big ones. For one thing, measuring our stack in terms of big blinds is a real-time shortcut to understanding what we want to gain by shoving, right? And what we want to gain by shoving is the equity gain represented by picking up the blinds, right? And generally speaking, stealing the 1.5 blinds pre-flop means more to a 5 big blind stack than it does to a 10 big blind stack. It's a larger percentage increase. In terms of just chips, it's a 30% increase to the 5 big blind stack, and it's only a 15% increase to the 10 big blind stack. And this is really why a 5 big blind stack is justified in shoving more widely, everything else being equal, than a 10 big blind stack, even with the same equity. The reason isn't because the 10 big blind stack is risking more, right? In identical equity scenarios, the 10 big blind stack is risking exactly what the 5 big blind stack is. It's the size of the blinds. What it is that the size of the blinds represents more of an equity boost to the 5 big blind stack, as I said, than it does to the 10 big blind stack. And then another reason why we can consider how many big blinds are in our stack is, from a non-ICM perspective, measuring our stack in big blinds helps us to assess what strategic options we actually have left. See, when we have a lot of big blinds, we have more moves available, right? More ways of gaining chips. We can limp in with a certain number of chips. We can limp in for set value. Blinds. We can limp in for set value. With another one, we have re-steal all in fold equity. With another one, we can shove all in and have fold equity. With another, we can make standard raises and fold to a shove, and so forth. So different big blinds, how our stack is chopped up, really tells us more about what we can do with it than what we have, right? And so therefore, the less strategic value that our stack has, the fewer blinds, the more justified we are in risking it to win the blinds. And that's sort of a non-ICM point. So I hope, this video has been like now 95 minutes, which is pretty ridiculous. But I hope that going through the process of creating your own ICM spreadsheet, while it was kind of tedious and time consuming, and even though the video is 90 minutes, you probably spent like 2.5 hours doing it because of all the stuff you had to fill in. But I think being able to actually understand your stack's value and where it comes from, and to be able to run risk-reward scenarios on your own, right? I think that empowers you to be your own best source of strategy, and you become less dependent on other people. So when you have a shove decision, you don't have to be like, oh boy, what do I do? I have no idea how to even think about it. Well, now you know how to think about it, right? You run your equity, you know how to calculate your equity, you know how to run risk-reward for calling and for shoving. So you become less dependent and you become your own best source of strategy. And I hope now that you're able to see that, quote, understanding ICM, as many players do. I understand ICM, I know when to shove and fold, is really quite a very, different thing than actually understanding it, than actually seeing the underlying factors and now how everything fits together. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments or complaints or whatever, feel free to go ahead and ask in the forums, and I will do my best. Anyway, thanks for watching.